Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. On Thursday, August 20th, Andy Reid pulled my son off a practice field in the middle of the last practice of training camp. He did not do it quietly. He said it out loud to reporters afterward. He praised Travis, and then he explained why they had to yank him. That was the word that got used. And it went out that afternoon and got covered as a normal football story. Veteran tight end, 36 years old, managing the workload, sensible. Everybody read it and nodded and moved on. I did not move on. Because I have known Andy Reid since 2013, and I have watched that man manage my son's body for 14 years, and Andy Reid does not explain himself to reporters about workload. He does it constantly, and he never mentions it. On Thursday, he mentioned it. And I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, and I thought, he wants somebody to hear that. He was not talking to the reporters. He was talking to one person, and it was not my son, and it was not the chief's medical staff, and it was not me. And I know that because I called him on Friday morning and asked him. And Andy Reid told me, I want to be careful here because I am about to describe a conversation with a man who has been extraordinarily good to this family for 14 years and who did not ask to be in one of these videos. I called him, and I asked, and he answered, and then I asked whether I could tell it, and he thought about it for a long time. And then he said one sentence which I am going to give you at the end, because it is the whole thing and it belongs at the end. But he said yes. So, on Thursday, August 20th, 2026, Andy Reid pulled Travis Kelce off a practice field. It was not about his knee. His knee is fine, sore, chronic since 2023, entirely manageable, and it was not the reason. It was not about his age, although his age is why he noticed. It was about something my son has been doing since about the second week of August, which nobody in that building had a name for, and which Andy Reid worked out on his own in about 4 days. It was about Taylor. And I am going to tell you something else before I start, because it happened 4 days earlier, and nobody connected the two, and I did not either until Sunday night. On the 19th of August, a story went out about their wedding rings. You may have seen it. Timeless but highly personal, it said. It described the gold and the design, and the fact that both bands are completely plain. It was accurate, and it was quite good, and it missed the entire thing. Because there is something inside both of those rings, and it has never been reported, and it is 2 dates. Not the wedding, not the engagement, 2 different days, one in each ring, and they are not the same day. I know what both of them are. And they are the answer to everything Andy Reid saw on that practice field, and they have been on my son's hand and my daughter-in-law's hand this entire time, and neither of them has turned the other ones over. Part 1. What he found out. I have to go back to the first week of August, because that is where this starts. Travis found out something about his wife. I have told pieces of this elsewhere, and I am going to give you the short version, because the long version is a different video. Taylor Swift has not said one public word since their wedding on July 3rd, 51 days as of today. One photograph in London on August 12th, and nothing else. No statement, no interview, no comment about her own wedding. The internet has decided it means about 11 different things, and every one of them is wrong. She decided it herself, alone, at 4:53 in the morning, on July 4th, 90 seconds after my son walked out of a hotel room to catch a plane to training camp. And the reason is this. If she talks, one interview, one post, one nice sentence about being married, then the last season of Travis Kelce's career becomes a season about them. So she is not going to talk until he is done playing, whenever that is. She told me in my kitchen on August 14th, and she made me write 2 words on a calendar in pencil. He was not supposed to know. She has been extremely clear about that. She told me, if he knows, it becomes a gift, and then he has to feel something about it, and then he has to thank me for it, and then every time the season goes badly, he has one more thing sitting on him. She said, I'm not putting that on a man who's already carrying 14 seasons and a knee. He worked it out anyway. He is not slow. He called me on August 22nd and asked me straight out whether she was doing something, and I did not lie to him, and I told him she was doing something for him, and that if he asked her about it, he would take it away from her. And there were 8 or 9 seconds of silence. And then my son said, Is it about the season? And I did not say anything, which is an answer. That was August 22nd. The yank was August 20th, which means he had worked it out before he asked me. He asked me to confirm something he already knew, which is a thing Travis does and which I did not notice at the time. I think he knew by about the 8th of August. Part 2. What he did about it. Here is what a man does with that information if he is my son. He does not talk about it. He does not thank her, because he understands, he understood immediately, faster than I would have, that thanking her would cost her the thing. He does not tell anybody. He does not slow down. He goes to work and he tries to be worth it. I want to describe what that looked like, because it is not dramatic and it is not visible, and that is exactly why it took a 68-year-old football coach 4 days to spot it. He did not do anything anybody could point at. He was not reckless. He did not take stupid hits. He did not do anything that would show up on a report. He just stopped taking the veteran days. Here is a thing about the NFL that people who do not follow it may not know. 36-year-old players do not do everything. There is an entire system built around this. Veterans get days off. They get reduced reps. They sit out the second half of a practice. Half of coaching a man in his mid-30s is deciding what he does not do. Travis has been on that system for about 3 years and has never once complained about it because he is not stupid and he wants to play. In the 2nd and 3rd weeks of August, he started refusing it. Not loudly. There was no scene. He just kept taking reps. Somebody would signal him out, and he would take one more. He would go in with the second group after finishing with the first. He was on that field before the position group got there, and he was on it after they left. He was, in the specific language of that building, chasing everything. Which is a thing a 24-year-old does. Part 2.5, the 2 weeks. I want to give you the 2 weeks in detail because it is the part I missed, and I want to show you exactly how invisible it was. August 7th. A Friday. He took a hard hit at practice and did not get up right away. 11 seconds of video went around the world. The team said no damage. He practiced the next day. I texted him that night and said left knee, and he said, How do you always know that? August 8th. Saturday. He practiced. He sent me a photograph of himself in pads at 7:40 in the morning with the caption, Told you. I thought that was funny. I did not think about the fact that a 36-year-old man with a chronic joint had gone out and practiced the morning after a hit that had frightened the entire internet, and that he had done it to prove something, and that he had photographed himself doing it. August 11th. Monday. He called me, and he was in a good mood, and he told me about camp for about 20 minutes. And somewhere in the middle of it he said, I'm in the best shape I've been in 4 years. And I said, That's wonderful. And he said, I've been doing extra. And I said, Don't overdo it. And he said, Mom, I'm fine. And that was the entire exchange, and I let it go, and it was the single clearest signal in the whole 2 weeks, and I missed it completely. August 13th and 14th. He flew to London and back. 14 hours with his wife in the middle of the last week of training camp. 38 hours total. 18 of them in the air. Almost no sleep. I have told that story, and I love that story, and it is one of the best things my son has ever done. It is also, and I did not think about this until Sunday, 38 hours of a 36-year-old body being deliberately destroyed in the middle of a training camp. He came back and stood on a sideline at Arrowhead on the 15th for 3 hours in Missouri heat on 4 hours of sleep across 2 days. I thought it was romantic. Andy Reid, I now know, thought something else. I asked him about that on Friday. I said, "Did you know about London?" And Andy Reid said, "I knew he was gone." I said, "Did you know where?" And he said, "I did not ask." Then he said, "I know a man who's been on a plane. I've been putting guys on and off planes for 30 years. He said, he came into that stadium on Saturday looking like he'd been through a wall." I said, "Did you say anything?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" And Andy Reid said, "Because a man went and saw his wife." He said, "I'm not going to be the guy who makes that a problem. He's 36 years old, and he's been married 5 minutes, and he found a hole in the schedule." Then he said, "I'd have done it." August 17th, 18th, 19th. The last 3 practice days. That is where it happened. Andy said, those 3 days is when it turned. He said, he came back from wherever he'd been, and he was tired, and instead of taking it easy, he took more. He said, Monday he was fine. Tuesday, I noticed. Wednesday, I was sure. Wednesday, the 19th, is the day Jason turned up. I have written about that too. Jason showed up unannounced, ate an ice cream bar, watched the second-to-last practice, went and found Andy Reid afterward. And Andy Reid said something to my eldest son that day that Jason repeated to me at the time and that I completely misunderstood. He said, "He's had a good camp. Best one in 3 years. Whatever's going on at home, keep it going on." I thought that was a compliment. I told the internet it was a compliment. I said it was Andy Reid recognizing that a man playing well because something is right at home. I called him on Friday and I asked him about it. I said, "When you said that to Jason on Wednesday, what did you mean?" And Andy Reid said, "I was asking him a question." I said, "That wasn't a question." And he said, "It was to Jason." He said, I said, "Whatever's going on at home," and I watched his face. He said, "I've known that kid since 2011. If there was nothing going on at home, he'd have said, 'Yeah, he's great.' He'd have laughed." He said, "He didn't laugh." I said, "What did he do?" And Andy Reid said, "He said, 'Yeah,' and looked at the field." He said, "So I knew there was something, and I knew it was at home, and I knew Jason knew what it was." He said, "And I decided right then that I was pulling him on Thursday." I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland and understood that on Wednesday, the 19th of August, in about 4 seconds, in a conversation I had already written a whole video about, Andy Reid had conducted an investigation and reached a conclusion and made a decision, and had done all of it while eating nothing and holding a laminated sheet, and that my son Jason had been interrogated without knowing it. Part 3. What Andy Reid did. Andy Reid noticed on about the 16th or 17th. He told me on Friday that it took him a few days to be sure, because a veteran having a good camp is a good thing, and you do not go poking at good things. He said, "I thought he was just having a year." He said, "You know, married, last one maybe, feeling it. That happens. Guys have a summer." Then he said, "And then on Monday I watched him go get in a drill he had no business being in." I said, "What did you do?" And Andy Reid said, "I asked around." He said he asked 2 of the position coaches, and he asked 1 of the training staff. And he asked them all the same question, which is a question I want you to hear, because it is the reason I have any respect left for professional sport. He asked, "Is he happy?" Not, "Is he healthy?" Not, "Is he a problem?" Not, "What is his rep count?" Is he happy? He said all three of them said yes. He said, and they were right, he was happy. He is happy. That kid has been the best version of himself all summer, and everybody in that building would tell you the same thing. Then he said, which is what worried me. I said, why? And Andy Reid said, because there's happy and there's paying. Part 4. Happy and Paying. I want to give you as much of this as I can, because it is the part of the conversation that made me stop taking notes and just listen. He said, I've been doing this a long time. He said, I've had a lot of guys who were happy, guys who got married, guys who had kids, guys who came out of something bad and were on the other side of it. He said, and happy shows up in the building in a certain way. Guys are lighter. They joke more. They're on time. They're easier to coach. He said, and then there's the other thing that looks exactly the same from about 10 feet away. He said, it's when a guy has been given something and he doesn't think he's earned it. He said, that shows up as effort. It shows up as a guy who won't come off the field. He said, and if you don't know what you're looking at, it looks like the best year of his life. I said, how do you tell them apart? And Andy Reid said, the guy who's happy takes the day off. He said, the guy who's paying can't. Part 4.5. Why he knows. I asked him. I said, Andy, how do you know that so well? And there was a pause on that telephone that went on long enough that I thought I had asked something I should not have. And then Andy Reid said, 1992. I am not going to tell this story in detail because it is his, and because he gave it to me carefully, and because I asked him 3 times whether he was sure. But he said yes, and he said to tell the shape of it, and so I will. In the early 90s, he was young, and he was working his way up, and he was gone. He said, I was gone in the way you're gone when you're that age in this business. Not physically gone all the time, gone in the room. He said, my wife raised those kids. He said, I want to be precise, because people say that and they mean it as a compliment to their wife. I mean it as a description of what happened. I was not there. She did it. He said, and there came a point where I understood that. I said, when? And he said, 92. He said, I don't want to say what it was. It was a family thing, and it was handled, and I found out afterward how it had been handled and who had handled it. He said, and I sat down somewhere and did some arithmetic about the previous 6 years. I said, what did you do? And Andy Reid said, I tried to pay it off. He said, for about 4 years. He said, I did every single thing I could think of. I was home more, which was good. I did things around the house, which was fine. I bought her things, which was stupid. He said, and none of it worked, and it did not work in a specific way that I could not name at the time. I said, what way? He said, she got quieter. He said, the more I did, the quieter she got. He said, and I could not work out why, because I was doing everything right. I said, what was it? And Andy Reid said, I was paying her off. He said, and she could feel it. He said, nobody wants to be paid. When somebody's paying you, they're settling up, and settling up is what you do before you leave. He said, she thought I was going somewhere. I sat in my kitchen with my hand over my mouth. He said, that's what it does, Donna. That's the thing about it that nobody tells you. He said, you think you're being generous. And what the other person is receiving is a man closing an account. I said, how did you fix it? And he said, I asked her for something. He said, I don't remember what it was, something stupid. Something around the house that I could have done myself in 10 minutes. He said, and she did it, and she was in a much better mood for about 2 days, and I did not understand why for about another year. Then he said, it's the only thing that works. You have to need them. He said, paying them makes it worse. Needing them fixes it. And then he said, which is why I asked him what he was trying to pay for. He said, I've been waiting 14 years to be able to say that to somebody in time. Part 5. Thursday, August 20th. The last practice of camp. Military Appreciation Day. 8:15 in the morning. He pulled him about halfway through. I asked him how he did it, and he laughed and said, not gracefully. He said, I waved him off and he pretended not to see me. I said, he pretended not to see you? And Andy Reid said, he has been doing that since 2013. He said, so I went and got him. I said, you walked out there? And he said, I walked out there. He said, and I said, you're done. And Travis said, I'm good, coach. And Andy Reid said, I know you're good, you're done. And then he said, and this is the part I have been sitting with since Friday. He said, and he stood there. He said, normally he'd argue. That kid has argued with me about coming off a field about 400 times in 14 years, and it is one of my favorite things about him. He said, he didn't argue. He just stood there and looked at me. He said, and I thought, oh, there it is. Part 6. What he asked him. He walked him off the field himself. Not to the sideline, off. Past the sideline, past the position group, over toward the building, the two of them, an 18-year age gap and a 14-year working relationship, walking across a practice field in St. Joseph, Missouri, in front of about 1,000 people who had come for Military Appreciation Day and were watching a coach walk a tight end off. And somewhere in that walk, Andy Reid asked him a question. I have the question from both of them. Andy told me on Friday. Travis told me on Saturday, unprompted, because it had been sitting in him for 3 days. Both accounts are identical. He said, what are you trying to pay for? Travis said he stopped walking. He said, Mom, I actually stopped. Physically. In the middle of a field. He said, and I said, what? And Andy said, what are you trying to pay for? Somebody gave you something. What was it? He said, and I could not say anything. He said, because the answer is that my wife gave up her entire year, and I'm not allowed to know about it, and I can't tell my head coach that, and I can't tell anybody that, and I have been walking around with it since about the 8th of August. He said, and this man just walked across a field and put it in a sentence. I said, what did you say? And my son said, nothing. I didn't say anything. He said, and he didn't make me. Part 6.5. His version of the walk. Travis told me about it on Saturday afternoon, and he told it the way he tells things that got to him, which is out of order and with a lot of stopping. He said, it was Military Appreciation Day. I said, I know. And he said, no, Mom, that's the thing. There were about 1,000 people there. There were veterans there. There were kids. He said, and he walked out onto the field and got me in front of all of them. He said, and I've been pulled off fields before. Everybody has. That's normal. That happens 40 times a year. He said, but he came and got me. He said, he doesn't do that. He signals. He sends somebody. In 14 years, I don't think that man has walked out onto a field to get me more than 3 times. He said, and the second I saw him coming, I knew it wasn't about my legs. I said, how? And my son said, because of how he was walking. He said, he was walking like my dad. I want to sit on that for a second. He said, I don't know how to explain it. He was walking the way Dad walks across a driveway when he's about to say something and he's decided he's going to say it. He said, it's a specific walk. It's not fast. There's no urgency in it. It's just extremely certain. He said, and I have been watching that walk since I was about 7 years old, and I saw it coming across a practice field in Missouri at 8:45 in the morning from a 68-year-old man who is not my father. And I thought, oh no. He said, so I stood there. He said, I didn't argue. I always argue. I've argued with that man about coming off a field since 2013, and it's a whole bit. He expects it. I expect it. He said, I couldn't do the bit. I said, why not? And he said, because I knew what he was about to ask me. I said, you knew? And Travis said, I didn't know the words. I knew the shape. He said, I'd been walking around for 2 weeks with something I couldn't say to anybody, and a man was walking toward me who was going to ask about it. He said, and the worst part is, I was relieved. I said, relieved? And my son said, yeah. He said, I've been carrying it since about the 8th. I couldn't tell Taylor because it would take it away from her. I couldn't tell you because you'd tell her. I couldn't tell Jason because Jason tells Kylie in 9 seconds. He said, I've been alone with it for 12 days. He said, and this man walked across a field and asked me, and for about 4 seconds I thought, thank God. He said, and then I couldn't answer it anyway. Part 6 and 3/4. The 1,000 people. There is a detail about that morning that I did not know until Sunday, and that I have not been able to stop thinking about. They were watched. Military Appreciation Day. Open practice. 1,000 people in the stands at Missouri Western State University, most of them families, a lot of them veterans, a lot of them children. And a head coach walked out onto a field, took a 36-year-old man by the arm, and walked him off in front of all of them. Somebody filmed it. Of course somebody filmed it. There are 1,000 people with telephones. There is footage of that walk. It is about 9 seconds long. I have watched it perhaps 30 times since Sunday. You cannot hear anything. It is from too far away, and there is crowd noise. You can see a coach and a player walking across a field, and you can see the player stop, once, about 2/3 of the way, for about a second and a half. That is the moment. That second and a half is the moment Andy Reid asked him what he was trying to pay for. It went online on Thursday afternoon with about 400 views and a caption that said something about Kelce getting a Veteran Day. Nobody thought anything of it. I have watched a 9-second video of the most important conversation of my son's summer about 30 times, and there is nothing in it. Just 2 men walking, and one of them stopping. Part 7. What Andy Reid said next. Travis said Andy stood there for a second, and then said something that took about 15 seconds, and that my son has repeated to me twice, once on Saturday and once again on Sunday, both times almost word for word, which is how I know it landed. He said, you can't pay it off. He said, I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know. But whatever somebody gave you, you can't work it off on my field. He said, you'll try. Guys try. I've watched guys try for 30 years. And then he said, it doesn't work, and it costs you the season, and then you've got nothing to give back at all. And then he said the last thing. He said, go home, call whoever it was, take the day. Part 8. What he did. He did not go home. Camp ended that afternoon anyway. But on the Thursday night, the 20th, the night camp ended, my son called me at 11 o'clock and said something about his wife that I have never heard him say about anybody, and it was not about gratitude. He was furious. I have made an entire video about that night, and I am not going to do it again here. Kylie ended up on the phone at 11:40 and said 6 words that reorganized this family. But I want to put one thing next to another thing, because I did not do it at the time, and it changes what I think happened. Andy Reid pulled my son off a field on Thursday morning and told him he could not pay it off. And Thursday night he called his mother, furious at his wife, because she would not let him give her anything. Same day, same thing. I did not connect those two until Sunday. I have been sitting on both halves of this story for 4 days, and I did not put them next to each other until I was drying a pan on Sunday afternoon, which is apparently where I do my thinking now. Andy Reid diagnosed it at 8:30 in the morning. And it came out of my son at 11 o'clock at night as anger at the person who had given him the thing, which is what always happens, and which nobody ever says out loud. Part 9. The thing nobody says. I want to say this properly because I think it is the most useful thing in this video, and it applies to everybody listening, whether or not they have ever been near a football field. When somebody gives you something you cannot repay, you do not feel grateful. Not first. Gratitude comes later, and gratitude is real, and I am not dismissing it. First, you feel angry. It does not feel like anger. That is the trick of it. It feels like determination. It feels like drive. It feels like a very good reason to work harder than you have worked in years. And then it comes out sideways, at 11 o'clock at night, at the person who gave it to you. I have watched this happen 4 times in my life. I watched it in my own marriage in the 1990s, in both directions, and neither of us had a word for it. I watched it in Jason in about 2016, after Kylie did something for him that I am not going to describe. I watched it in my own mother in 1983, and I watched it in my son on August 20th, 2026, and I did not recognize it, and a 68-year-old football coach spotted it from 10 feet away on a practice field in Missouri and pulled him off before he wrecked himself. Part 10. The part that is about her. Now I have to tell you the other half, because so far this has been a story about a man on a field. Taylor has been doing exactly the same thing. I did not see it either. She told me on Sunday, on the telephone, after I told her about Andy Reid and the field and the sentence, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, Donna, I've been doing it too. I said, doing what? And she said, paying. She said, I've been telling myself for 50 days that the silence is a gift. She said, and it is. I meant it, and I'd do it again. Then she said, and there's another thing underneath it, and I have not said it out loud to anybody. She said, he married me. I said, yes. And she said, no. Listen, he married me. She said, he took on the security and the schedules, and the fact that his brother has to have a bodyguard now, and his nieces will never be private, and his mother gets recognized in a grocery store in Cleveland. She said, he took all of that, and he has never once complained about a single piece of it, and he never will. She said, and I cannot pay that back. She said, there is no amount of anything I can do that makes that even. Then she said, so I've been trying. She said, the silence, the 4:30 phone calls, sending Jason to camp, not asking him for anything, ever, so I'm never one more thing on him. She said, I've been telling myself all of it is generosity. She said, about half of it is a woman trying to get out of debt. I did not say anything for a moment, and then I said, Taylor, do you know what Andy Reid said to him? And she said, you told me, you can't pay it off. And I said, yes. And she said, I know. And I said, no. I mean, he said it to you too. Part 10 and a half, what she did when she heard. I asked her on Sunday what she thought when she saw the news about the yank. Because she saw it. Of course she saw it. It went out on Thursday afternoon, and she reads everything, and she has read everything about that man since 2023. I said, what did you think when you read it? And Taylor Swift said, I called the trainer. I said, you called the trainer? And she said, yes. I said, Taylor. And she said, Donna, I know what that joint does, and I know what a pull means, and I was not going to sit in another country and read a paragraph. She said, I called and I asked one question, which was, is it the knee? And they said no. And she said, and then I said, then what is it? And there was a pause on the phone. And whoever it was said, it's a coach's decision. She said, which is the single most alarming sentence anybody has ever said to me. I said, why? And she said, because if it were his body, they'd have said his body. If it were precautionary, they'd have said precautionary. Those are boring answers, and boring answers are good. She said, coach's decision means somebody made a judgment about a person and not about a joint. She said, and I sat there in another country and thought, oh God, what has he done? I said, what did you think he'd done? And she said, I thought he'd been fighting with somebody. I said, Travis? And she said, I know how that sounds. He's the least likely person in America to be fighting with somebody in a locker room. Then she said, but he's been off since about the 8th of August, and I could hear it every night, and I did not know what it was. I stopped. I said, you could hear it? And Taylor said, obviously I could hear it. She said, I talk to that man every single day. We have not missed one since July 4th. 51 days. She said, you cannot talk to somebody for 51 consecutive days and not know when something changes. I said, what changed? And she said, he got busier. She said, not on the phone, in himself. He'd call and he'd be fine and warm and completely present, and underneath it there was something running. She said, he was doing something. I could hear that he was doing something, and I did not know what it was. I said, did you ask him? And she said, no. And I said, why not? And Taylor Swift said, because he'd have told me. I did not understand, and I said so. And she said, Donna, if I ask that man a direct question, he cannot lie to me. He physically cannot do it. It's the best thing about him. She said, which means I have to be extremely careful what I ask. She said, because if he's carrying something on purpose, if he's decided to carry something himself, for a reason, then me asking is me taking it off him, and he might have needed to carry it. She said, so I waited. She said 14 days. I heard something in my husband's voice on about the 8th of August, and I waited 14 days to find out what it was, and I found out on Sunday from his mother. And then she said the thing that finished me. She said, and it turns out he was doing all of it for me. She said, for 14 days I heard him carrying something and decided to leave it alone out of respect, and the thing was me. Part 11. Both of them. That is what this is. I want to say it as plainly as I can because it took me 4 days. 2 people got married on July 3, 2026. And both of them privately decided that the other one had given them something they could not possibly repay. And both of them, separately, without telling each other, without telling anybody, started paying. He paid on a football field in Missouri until a coach walked out and stopped him. She paid in silence, in 4:30 in the morning phone calls, in 51 days of not saying one word about her own wedding. Neither of them knew the other one was doing it. Both of them thought they were the one in debt. I have been married for 46 years, and I have never seen it that cleanly. Part 12. What she said on Sunday. She said, what do I do? And I said, I don't know. She said, that's not helpful. And I said, I know it isn't. I've been doing this for 46 years, and I got out of debt with Ed at some point in about 1997, and I could not tell you how. Then she said, can I tell you the stupid thing? I said, yes. And she said, I know exactly what would fix it. I said, what? And Taylor Swift said, he'd have to need something from me. Not want, need. Something that only I can do, and that costs me something. She said, and there isn't anything. She said, he's got a whole team of people. He's got you. He's got his brother. He's the most loved man in America. She said, what am I for? I want you to hear that sentence next to the one my son said on August 20th at 11 o'clock at night. He said, what am I for? She said, what am I for? 4 days apart. Neither of them knows the other one said it. Part 13. The singing. Something did happen, and I have told this elsewhere, but it belongs here too, because it is the only thing in 8 weeks that has actually worked. On Friday the 21st at 1 in the morning, Travis called her and asked her to teach him to sing properly. Not the wedding thing, an actual thing, lessons. And she said yes, and they did the first one on Friday afternoon, on a video call, and she shouted at him for 35 minutes and stopped him 11 times in the first 20 minutes and told him he was doing a thing to make it funny so it would not count if it was bad. And he told me it was the best hour he has had all year. And she told me she has been sitting on 6 specific notes about that man's voice since 2024 and has never been able to say one of them because he had never asked. I did not understand at the time why that worked. I understand now. It is the only thing in 3 years that either of them has needed from the other one that could not be bought, delegated, arranged, or done by a team of professionals. There is not a person on this earth who can teach Travis Kelce to sing except his wife. She is the only supplier. And she said something to me on Sunday about it that I want to give you. She said, "He doesn't understand what he did." I said, "What did he do?" And she said, "He found the one thing." She said, "He probably wasn't even looking. He was angry, and Kylie told him to ask for something, and he grabbed the first thing." She said, "And it happened to be the only thing in the world that I can do for him, that nobody else can." Then she said, "And now I owe him for that too." And then she laughed, and I laughed, and neither of us thought it was funny. Part 14. What Andy Reid said to me. I said I would give you the sentence at the end. On Friday morning, when I called him and asked him about Thursday, we talked for about 20 minutes. And at the end of it, I asked him if I could tell it. And he was quiet for long enough that I started to apologize. And then he said, "Has anybody told her?" I said, "Told who what?" And he said, "His wife. Has anybody told her she can't pay it off either?" I sat in my kitchen with the telephone. I said, "How do you know she's doing that?" And Andy Reid said, "Donna, I have been married for 45 years. He said, "It's always both of them." He said, "I have never once in my life seen one person in a marriage trying to get out of debt on their own." Then he said the sentence. He said, "Tell it, but tell them the part where it's both." Part 14 and a quarter. The rings. On the 19th of August, a story came out about their wedding rings. You may have seen it. It ran everywhere. It described the rings as timeless but highly personal, and it went into the design and the metal and the choices, and it was, as these things go, quite good. It got about a day, and it missed the thing. I want to tell you about the rings, because I have been waiting 7 weeks for somebody to ask the right question about them and nobody has, and because they turn out to be the exact same story I have been telling you for 40 minutes. Here is what is publicly known. They are gold. They are plain. There is nothing on the outside of either of them. No stones, no pattern, no detail. From 4 feet away, they are 2 ordinary wedding bands, and that is entirely deliberate. That got reported as understated, timeless, a choice. It is a choice, but not the one everybody wrote about. There is something on the inside. There is something engraved inside both rings, and it has never been reported, and I know what it is because Taylor told me at my kitchen table on the 14th of August, in the middle of the afternoon, that I have talked about elsewhere. She told me because I asked. She had her hands on the table, and I could see the ring, and I said, "Is there anything in it?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Is it a secret?" And she said, "Not from you." There is a date inside each ring, not the wedding date, not the engagement date. 2 different dates. His has one, and hers has a different one. I said, "What's yours?" And Taylor Swift said, September 6th, 2023. I put my hand flat on my own kitchen table. September 6th, 2023, is the Wednesday afternoon I let myself into my son's house in Leawood, Kansas, with a key he gave me years ago, and found a woman I had never met standing at the counter with a wooden spoon in her hand. It is the day I met her. It is 18 days before the world found out. It is the day she had learned to rap a knee off the internet and made a soup that a man on painkillers could eat. That date is inside my daughter-in-law's wedding ring. I said, "Why that one?" And she said, "Because that's the day I found out what I was actually getting." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I'd known him about 3 weeks, and I turned up at his house because he was hurt, and I'd been there about 4 hours when his mother walked in." She said, and I thought, this is over. She's going to hate me. Every mother hates the woman who turns up at week 3. Then she said, "And you looked at the knee and said, 'That's right,' and asked me where I'd learned to do it." She said, "That's the whole thing, Donna. That's the entire reason it's that date." She said, "I met his family on day 22, and they let me in." She said, "I have been let into a great many rooms in my life, and I have almost never been let into anything." I said, "What's his?" And she said, "You'll have to ask him." I asked him on Saturday. He was in a good mood. This was after the singing lesson, after everything. And I said, "What's the date in your ring?" And there was a pause. And my son said, "She told you hers?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Huh." He said, "Mine's November 12th, 2025. I did not know that date. I sat there and went through 2025 in my head and could not place it, and eventually I said, "What happened on November 12th? And Travis Kelce said, "Nothing." I said, "Travis." And he said, "Genuinely nothing. That's the point." He said, "It was a Wednesday. It was the middle of the worst stretch of my career, and we were losing every week, and I was 36, and everything hurt." He said, "And she came over, and we didn't do anything. We didn't go anywhere, and we didn't talk about anything." He said, "We sat in my house for about 6 hours, and I think we watched something." He said, "And at some point I looked over at her, and she was asleep on the couch." He said, "Not at night. It was about 4 in the afternoon. She'd fallen asleep sitting up with her shoes off in the middle of a Wednesday." He said, "And I sat there and looked at her and thought, she's not performing." He said, "I know that sounds stupid. I know how it sounds." He said, "But Mom, that woman is on for about 19 hours a day. Everybody who has ever been in a room with her has got a version of her that's slightly on." He said, "And she was asleep on my couch with her mouth open in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in the worst November of my life." He said, and I thought, she's safe here. Then he said, and I thought, that's what I'm for. I sat in my kitchen holding a telephone. Because that is the sentence. That is the exact sentence he said to me at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th, in the other direction. On November 12th, 2025, my son looked at a sleeping woman on his couch and understood what he was for. And 9 months later he called his mother furious because he could not remember. I asked him whether he had told her, and he said, "Told her what?" I said, "What the date is. What happened?" And he said, "She knows the date. She had them made." And I said, "Does she know what it is?" And my son said, "I don't know." He said, "I told her the date and she put it in and she never asked." I said, "She never asked?" And Travis said, "No." She said, "Do you want to tell me?" And I said, "Not yet." And she said, "Okay." And that was about 8 months ago. I said, "Why didn't you tell her?" And he said, "Because it's about her being tired." He said, "It's about her having her mouth open, asleep on a couch, and I didn't know how to say, 'The best moment of my life was watching you not be impressive,' without it sounding like an insult." Part 14 and a half, What I Did on Sunday. I told her. I want to be honest about this, because it was not mine to tell, and I did it anyway. On Sunday afternoon, on the telephone, in the middle of the conversation about ledgers and debt, and Andy Reid on a practice field, she said the thing about how there is nothing she can do that he actually needs. She said, "What am I for?" And I could not sit there with it. I said, "Taylor, do you know what the date in his ring is?" And she said, "November 12th. And I said, "Do you know what happened?" And she said, "No." He said, "Not yet." And I said, "I'm going to tell you, and I should not, and I'm going to do it anyway." And I told her. The Wednesday, the 6 hours, the couch, 4 in the afternoon, her shoes off and her mouth open. I told her what he said, which is that she was not performing, and that he thought, "She's safe here," and that he thought, "That's what I'm for." There was a silence on that telephone that went on so long that I said her name twice, and then Taylor Swift said, and her voice was not right, "I remember that day." She said, "I remember it because I was so embarrassed." I said, "Embarrassed?" And she said, "I fell asleep. In front of him. In the middle of the afternoon." She said, "I woke up and I did not know how long I'd been out, and I apologized about 4 times." She said, "I thought I'd been rude. I thought, he's having the worst season of his career, and I came over and fell asleep on his couch." She said, "I have thought about that afternoon for 9 months as the day I was rude to my husband." She said, "He put it in his ring." Part 14 3/4. What that means. I want to say what I think this actually is, because I did not understand it until Sunday night and it kept me up. Two people put dates inside their wedding rings. She chose the day she was led into a family. He chose the day she was too tired to be impressive. Neither of them chose the wedding. Neither of them chose the engagement. Neither of them chose an achievement or a moment or anything anybody has ever written about. She chose the day somebody accepted her. He chose the day she stopped performing. And they have both spent 51 days since the wedding doing the exact opposite of both of those things. She has spent 51 days performing an enormous act of self-sacrifice in complete silence. He has spent 2 weeks on a football field trying to be so impressive that he earns her. They have got 2 dates inside 2 rings that say the whole answer, and they are both wearing them, and neither of them has looked. I said that to her on Sunday. Not that cleanly. I said it badly, and it took me about 4 minutes. And when I finished, she said, "I need to go." And I said, "Taylor." And she said, "No, I'm fine, I'm fine. I need to go and call him." I do not know what happened on that phone call. I have not asked either of them, and I am not going to. But he called me on Monday morning, yesterday, and he did not mention it, and he was in a very strange mood, and at the end of the call he said one thing. He said, "Hey, Mom." I said, "What?" And my son said, "Did you tell her about November?" And I said, "Yes." And there was a pause. And he said, "Okay." And then he said, "Thanks." And he hung up. Part 14 1/2, my 2. I said earlier that I found a second ledger on Sunday, drying a pan, and I have been avoiding it for about 10 minutes, and I am going to do it now, because I have not asked anybody in this video to do a single thing I have not done myself. I have got 2. The first one is Ed. In 1989, my husband's coaching career ended, and it was not his choice, and it was not his fault. And in 1989, I was offered a job in another state, and I did not tell him about it, and I let it expire, because I knew that if I told him, he would have said take it, and he would have meant it, and he would have moved his family during the worst year of his life and never complained. I have told that story. Here is what I have not said, because I did not know it until Sunday. I have been paying him off since 1990. 36 years. I have done things for that man for 36 years that I told myself were love, and that were about 50% of them a woman, balancing a ledger that only she can see. The cooking, the house, the way I have run his life around his knees for the last decade. I thought I was being a wife. About half of it is 1989. And here is the thing that I understood on Sunday afternoon with a dry pan in my hand. He has been doing the same thing. Ed Kelce has been carrying two of my secrets for a combined 94 years. I told him about 1974 in a car in 1979 and asked him not to mention it, and he did not mention it for 47 years. He worked out what I had picked for the wedding donation on the 6th of July and said nothing for 6 weeks. That is not just discretion. That man has been paying me off since 1979. I do not know what for. I genuinely do not. I asked him on Sunday night. I said, "Ed, what do you think you owe me?" And he looked at me like I had asked him about the weather on Mars. And then he thought about it for about 40 seconds, which is an extremely long time to watch a man think. And he said, 1983. And I said, "What happened in 1983? And Ed Kelce said, "You know what happened in 1983. I do know. I am not going to tell you, because it is not a secret. It is simply a very ordinary hard year that happened to two young people with a small child and no money. I have not thought about 1983 in 20 years. He has been paying for it for 43. The second one is Travis. This is the one I found on Sunday, and it is worse. I have a ledger with my own son, and it has been running since about 2009, and it is about the fact that I could not always go. There were games I did not get to. That is all it is. There were games in college, and there were games early in his career, and there were things I could not do because I was working, and because a plane ticket was a plane ticket, and because there were two of them and only one of me. I missed things. He has never once mentioned it, not one time in his entire life. And I have been paying it off since about 2009 with a key on a ring and a bag by a door and a woman who says, "I'm already packing," before her son has finished asking. I am not going to stop doing that. I want to be clear. I am 73 years old, and if that boy calls me at 11 o'clock at night, I am going to Kansas City, and there is no video on the internet that is going to change it. But I would like to know how much of it is love and how much of it is 2009. And I have decided the answer is that I do not get to know, and that this is probably fine, and that most of what people call love is a mixture of the real thing and an old bill, and that this does not make it less. Part 14 3/4, September 14th. There is one more thing Andy Reid said to me on Friday, and I have been saving it. I asked him about the season. I said, "Is he going to be all right?" And he said, "Physically, yes." And I said, "That is not what I asked." And Andy Reid laughed and said, "I know it isn't." He said, "Here's what I'm worried about." He said, September 14th, Denver, Monday night, Arrowhead, 8:15. He said, "She's going to be in that building." I said, "She is." And he said, "First time this season. First time since the wedding that they're going to be in the same place with a football game in the middle of it." He said, "And every camera in America is going to be pointed at that box." He said, "And he knows that." He said, "He has known that since the schedule came out in May." Then he said, "Donna, I have watched that man play with her in the building about 40 times now." He said, "And he is a different player when she's there. Everybody says that. It's not a secret. It's not even unusual. Half the guys in that league are different when their family's in." He said, "And normally it's good. Normally a guy plays about 4% better because somebody's watching who he cares about." He said, "I do not think September 14th is going to be normal." I said, "Why not?" And Andy Reid said, "Because he's not trying to impress her anymore." He said, "He's trying to pay her." He said, "And a guy trying to impress somebody plays about 4% better." He said, "A guy trying to pay somebody plays about 11% worse and gets hurt in the third quarter." I sat in my kitchen and did not say anything. And he said, "Which is why I pulled him on Thursday. It wasn't about Thursday." He said, I've got 25 days to get that out of him before Denver. I said, how are you going to do that? And Andy Reid said, I've got no idea. He said, I've been coaching for 30 years, and I have got no idea. You can't coach that out of a man. There's no drill. Then he said, which is why I told you to tell it. I said, what? And he said, Donna, I could have told you all that on Friday and asked you to keep it to yourself. You'd have kept it. You've kept everything, he said. I told you because you make videos. I sat in my kitchen and did not say anything for a while. And then I said, is there anything I can do? And Andy Reid said, you've done it. I said, I haven't done anything. And he said, Donna, you called me on a Friday morning to ask why I pulled your son off a field. He said, do you know how many mothers have called me in 30 years? I said, a lot? And Andy Reid said, 4. He said, they call about playing time. They call about doctors. Once somebody called me about a coach's language, which was fair. He said, nobody has ever called me to ask what I saw. Then he said, you saw the same thing I did. You just saw it from Ohio. I said, I didn't see it at all. I missed every single sign for 2 weeks. And Andy Reid said, you saw it on Friday morning at 8 o'clock when you picked up a phone. He said, that's when you saw it. That's soon enough. Part 15. For the people listening, this is the part where I say the thing to you. And this week I have got a good one. Somebody has given you something you cannot pay back. A husband who did something, a child who moved back, a sister who took 6 months off, a friend who sat in a hospital, and you have been paying it off ever since, quietly, in small increments, in things you do without being asked and never mention. And you have called it love, and it is love, and it is also a ledger. Here is what a football coach said on a practice field in Missouri on the 20th of August. You can't pay it off. You will try. Everybody tries. And it does not work, and it costs you the season, and then you have got nothing to give back at all. And here is the other half, which is the half Andy Reid told me to make sure I said. The person who gave it to you is doing the same thing. They are. I promise you they are. Whatever you think you owe them, they have got their own version of it running in the other direction, and they have not told you either, and if you asked them tonight they would be shocked. It is always both of them. So if you have got a ledger going, and I have got 2 of them, I found the second one on Sunday drying a pan, ask the other person what they think they owe you, not what they want, not how they feel, what they think they owe you. And be prepared, because the answer is going to be enormous, and it is going to be something you did in about 1994 that you have completely forgotten. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. On Thursday morning, a 68-year-old man in Missouri walked out onto a practice field in front of 1,000 people and took my son by the arm and asked him what he was trying to pay for. On Thursday night, my son called me furious at his wife. And on Sunday afternoon, his wife told me she has been trying to get out of debt since the 4th of July. Neither of them knew about the other one. They have been married for 51 days, and they are in the same marriage, and neither of them can see it. And a football coach, who has known one of them for 14 years and the other one for none, worked it out from 10 feet away. There are 2 dates inside 2 gold rings. One of them is the day somebody let her in. One of them is the day she was too tired to be impressive. Both of them are already answers. Both of them have been on their hands the entire time. There is a photograph of one of those rings from Arrowhead on the 15th of August that about 4 million people looked at last week, and every single article about it said the same thing, which is, how sweet newlyweds, he cannot bear to take it off. Nobody turned it over. 22 days until Denver. Thank you for sitting with me today.